which I will do now. And good morning, everyone. I'm Rebecca Snyder. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland-Delaware DC Press Association, and I'm delighted to tell you that Sunshine Week never ends. We are here to talk today about the implementation of Anton's Law. Last week for Sunshine Week, MDDC released a report for Sunshine Week detailing the implementation of Anton's Law in Maryland. So we wanted to convene a panel to continue that discussion. Miranda Spivack, who is with us in my upper left-hand corner, is an award-winning investigative journalist specializing in government, politics, and accountability stories, and is a former reporter for the Washington Post. She reported about the implementation of Anton's Law for our Sunshine Week package, which you may have read in our member publications. Now, today's panel continues that conversation, discussing the goals of the legislation, where we are now, the implications of funding and court cases, and where we head next. So I'll turn it over to Miranda, but actually before I do that, I apologize. If you have questions for the panel, we will be reserving a little bit of time at the end of the session. Just put them in the chat and we will get to them as we can. Thanks so much. Miranda?
Thanks, Rebecca. Welcome, everybody. We don't know if our two legislators who were the authors of this legislation are actually going to turn up, because they fooled us by going into earlier session than we had assumed was going to happen. So we'll see what happens with that. But we have two really great panelists, Matt Zernhelt and Yanet Amanuel. She's from the ACLU. Matt is from BALT, which is some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, but they are a legal organization that has done a lot of work on trying to open up records from the Baltimore Police Department. As my report showed, the functioning of Anton's Law is definitely, I wouldn't say it's on life support, but it is definitely not working probably as well as we had all hoped, which is to say that a lot of people have made requests for police disciplinary records, internal records, which until the law was passed were not subject to the Maryland Public Information Act. And a lot of the people, some of whom I'm sure are on this call, are journalists, they're advocates, they're defense lawyers, all kinds of people who want access to these records for a whole variety of reasons. Probably the most important is to see if we are able to keep police agencies accountable to the public, and that bad cops don't get to hang around and the good ones get to stay and are well known. But it's not working. The fees are enormous. One group in Montgomery County that I wrote about was hit with a $95,000 fee. I mean, these are just laughable. And others, public defenders around the state, have been getting enormous fees. On the flip side, of course, the government agencies say this is an unfunded mandate. They were asked to do something that they're not prepared for in terms of staffing. In many jurisdictions, the records are not digitized, which in this day and age is shocking, but not surprising in some ways. I mean, one could certainly argue that local governments are underfunded, and police agencies, of course, will tell you that, but they're in the worst spot for that. So we're going to talk about how the law is working, what could be done to improve the legislation. And as many of you know, last week, the state Senate approved a commission, which is, one reporter friend to me said, this is very Maryland, we'll have another study. But they are going to look at the issue of high fees with police discipline records. And on July 1st, another law takes effect that will give the Public Records Commission, and I'm probably not naming that correctly, but it does give them a little more power to analyze the fee issue across the board, which of course isn't just something that the police will charge, but many state and local governments also. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who is the legal director for BALT, and he can talk about some pending litigation, and his view about the commission and anything else he wants to tell us. Matt, you're on.
Thanks, Miranda. Yeah, I'm Matt. I'm the legal director with BALT, Baltimore National Legal Team. We are a community legal organization that works to advance the missions of community organizations in Baltimore City. We've got a few programs doing direct services, litigation, and policy advocacy. We've been working to push PIA record requests for probably over 2 years now. We first started putting in some PIA requests in mass towards the end of 2019 to BPD, and we've been getting strong pushback. So everything that they're trying now is just, new ways, new forms of what they've been doing since then. I find BPD, it's always a new excuse. I don't think there's any intention to make their records available. I think there's huge liability that comes with making their records available. And I also think that it's not just BPD that's fighting making their records available. I think a lot of the pushback that we get, a lot of the questionable behavior that we get comes from the Baltimore City Department of Law, who's also on the call right now. I can see. Welcome. Hello. We see a lot of things that are not in line with what the intention of the Public Information Act is. When we go to court, we see things like there's a provision in the Public Information Act that says a custodian, whoever holds these records that we're asking for, can charge a requester for the records. But if records are in the public interest, it's in the public interest to disclose these records. A custodian has to take that into consideration, and making genuine consideration, if there is genuine consideration, the record should be disclosed for free. So BPD, and working in concert with the law department, basically says, all right, well, we just don't think it's in the public interest to make our misconduct records, how we hold our police accountable, in the public interest. So since it's not in public interest, we don't have to give it over for free. So now we have to go to the court and argue that they're obviously just playing, a song and dance, saying that this stuff's not in the public interest, and draining the community of resources, and trying to play this master game of chicken of who's going to drop out first, because they're a huge law firm, that runs and funded by the city of Baltimore. We're a community organization, trying to get them to disclose. And right now we've got 5 active cases, and we're not just talking about these massive records requests that we are asking for, of 6 months or of a year of records. We've simply asked for an active roster of employees, so we can see who's even carrying police powers, who's on the force right now, with a badge and a gun in the community, and they're telling us, no, we don't have to hand that over to you, and coming up with excuses that are so far from even close to applicable law, and just ignoring us and stop responding to us. And we've had the court come back and say, you are not acting in good faith. And we've recently, had judgments against BPD as represented by the law department.
Can I ask you a question? What is the rationale for not providing a list of government employees whose names are a matter of public record under the PIA, and which would also apply to police? What do they use as the rationale for that, for not providing it?
Their claim was that it was an investigatory record, which even investigatory records are disclosable, but they're saying it's an investigatory record, and giving you all the police names would disclose undercover officers, and that would make undercover officers at risk. So we said, fine, just redact the undercover officers, give us the rest. You can redact those 10 or 15 officers, but the other almost 3,000 officers you can pull out. That's going to take you 10 minutes of work. And they said, nope, sorry, and just stopped responding. They just would not do it. And the court came back and said, no, you knowingly and willfully violated the PIA and you have to do this. And right now they got fined, but the maximum fine that they can be fined under the PIA, the Public Information Act, is $1,000. So it's kind of, there's no incentive for them to not violate the PIA. It's kind of, just take us to court, and if we lose, we'll just do what we were supposed to do in the first place. There's also attorney's fees. Right now, they're assessing attorney's fees, and I don't know what the court's going to say about that. But still, I'd rather not have to use our resources to sue for something so silly that they should be doing to begin with. And that's kind of where we're at with these cases.
Okay. Says I'm muted. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. We can hear you
Yes,
now.
sorry about that. Yanet Amanuel is with the ACLU of Maryland, and she is the interim policy director. And the ACLU of Maryland has some interesting cases also that perhaps you can tell us about, as well as your work as the policy director and what you sort of see on the horizon.
Yeah, thank you again for having me here today. So I want to start just by stating what the purpose of the Maryland Public Information Act is, and that, as stated by Attorney General Frosch in the manual, is that the MPI is based on the enduring principle that the public knowledge of government activities is critical to the functioning of a democratic society, and that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people must be open to the people. I think that's really important in when we're discussing just the kind of the pushback, what we're experiencing now, and just how long it took to even get to this moment. I think is disappointing to see just the amount of resistance that we are getting. So since the bill has gone into effect, we've received numerous amount of folks reaching out to us, letting us know how the feedback that they're getting or they're experiencing when trying to access these records. We've heard from folks from all across the state. So for example, in Prince George's County, we heard from someone that made a request, and it only took less than 2 hours to receive a response back from the county attorney, stating that the request was denied because it was not in the interest of the public, or it was part of an investigative file. We've also received responses from people letting us know that they've, requesting even just information about criminal and internal complaints from 5 officers resulted in $8,000. And that's kind of more on the lower end, whereas other departments, other folks have received $500,000, $900,000 worth of fees. And so it's kind of ranges, but it's still excessive in its fees. And more recently, we filed a lawsuit in Calvert County because after receiving disturbing accounts from local residents about invasive police searches of Black residents, including cavity searches and strip searches in the middle of the night, we put in a request asking for body search documents relating to body searches, cavity searches, and strip searches from 2017 to the present, and any audio or body cam footage associated with those complaints. And what we received back, and we asked for a fee waiver, that was obviously denied. And then even after we paid the fee, still didn't receive the files, which I think is consistent with some folks are experiencing as well, is just delayed in actually receiving files, even after they've paid, not receiving the files at all. And so we went ahead and we recently filed a lawsuit, and this seems to be consistent with what BALT is experiencing in Baltimore County, just this resistance. And it's really critical that we do, get access to these records. They're currently, recently also there was a lawsuit filed in Prince George's County against about alleging systemic federal civil rights violations of Black and brown people in the county. And there's this pattern of police abuse. And then once, for example, what happened in the case with William Green, they took Michael Owens to court and found that he had a history of police misconduct complaints that were completely ignored. Similar in what happened in the DeMonte Ward case, Blake, the officer in that case, Officer Brian Strong, also had a history of police misconduct records that were just ignored. And he actually appeared in the Graham report having a history of police misconduct, use of force complaints. And so these complaints were ignored, and it ultimately cost people their lives. And so there are real consequences to not to the public not having transparency over how these complaints are being investigated, because it allows these officers to continue to be on the force and to continue to get away with what they're getting away with. And that the public needs that transparency. And it further erodes the trust, any trust that can be built between the community and police when departments do push back and don't comply with the law. And so I think it's clear that there needs to be, we need to go back and add some teeth to the bill in order to have some kind of enforcement mechanism to make sure that actually departments are complying and figure out, is it that some departments are under-resourced or understaffed, or is it that they're, intentionally understaffing some of these departments so that they can't comply? And so I think it's really critical that we need to get to the bottom of it and should be the legislators' priority next session.
Sounds good. Can you just remind us all what the Graham report was in Prince George's County and why that would be significant in the context of Anton's law?
Yeah, so the Graham report was a result, the last couple of years ago, we filed a lawsuit against the Prince George's County Police Department due to racism and sexism that Black and brown officers on the force were facing. And through that discovery, we obtained a report that detailed a history of use of force complaints and also just different complaints that internal complaints that police officers had reported and how those were handled. And the judge eventually determined that report should be unsealed and released to the public because it was in the interest of the public. And what it detailed was that between 2016 to 2019, there were nearly 7,000 use of force complaints. And of those almost 7,000 use of force complaints, about 98.2% of them were deemed justified. So that means in all of those cases, they decided that those use of force instances were justified. And some of those officers that were named in that report included some of these officers that are now being prosecuted for their involvement in serious use of force instances. And that includes individuals like the officer that was involved in the DeMonte Ward case, Blake, which was a young man who was initially pulled over for a broken taillight and ended up with his spine being injured and being rendered wheelchair, had to paralyze from the waist down and recently passed away. And then we also had the William Green case. So what the report showed is that there's clearly something the departments have been hiding that should have been accessible to the public, and there should have been that transparency, and there wasn't. And so that was the Graham report, and kind of the value of that report. Just basically what that report did was state what the people have already been saying in the community and the actors that the community had already identified. There's numerous people that were named in that report that with speaking with different local coalitions and organizations have said, oh, I know that officer, and I'm familiar with that, with the kind of pattern that officer, use of force that pattern with that officer. I've seen it myself. And so it again, just justifies and solidifies what the people have already been saying. But it shows clearly that pattern exists, and which is why it's critical that we do have that transparency.
So one question to either one of you about use of force and how that is logged and made public or not made public. Is there any kind of mechanism in the state, and if not in this state, in other states, where there would be some kind of annual statement by each department about use of force and who's involved and what the findings were? Or is that just sort of another piece that could happen under Anton's law? I don't know who wants to take that.
I'm not clear if that currently exists in other states, but I think that is part of the goal of having access to these records, is to be able to establish that kind of reporting to show those patterns and which departments have more excessive cases and how they're being handled and where we need to focus our attention on.
But in the case of Anton's law, it's sort of, it's not a proactive disclosure by the departments, right? I mean, if you happen to ask a department for their use of force reports, you might get them, as we hear also, you might not get them. But, are the departments keeping that in some coherent fashion? And, would it be worth adding that specifically to legislation to tell them they have to keep it this way? And do a report to the public every quarter or something like that? Is that a feasible option?
I think part of the legislation that passed last year with use of force requires some kind of reporting. The law hasn't gone into effect yet, so I'm not sure how comprehensive that reporting is going to be.
Yeah.
But I think absolutely those are things that we want to keep track of and want to make public.
Yeah. Matt, can you tell us a little bit more about the Court of Special Appeals ruling in Baltimore that whether it's going to potentially can be binding on the entire state as far as forcing disclosure, or whether it's going to just apply to Baltimore?
Sure. So this was one of the cases that we did start about 2 years ago. We filed it in March 2020, just before the pandemic came on. And that's just to show how long some of these cases can take to get to an appellate ruling. We asked for a year's worth of records, and this was before Anton's law was really ever on the radar of passing. We had asked for records with names redacted to be able to get personnel records, with them not being considered personnel records under another case. But it just so aligned with Anton's law being passed. When this opinion came out, we could now get them. The law, or as the case came out, BPD fought us all the way, even though we had this case law that said the way that we requested the records, they are disclosable. BPD said, we're not even reading your case law, take us to court, we're not complying whatsoever. The court said, no, these records are disclosable. There was a big dispute over the fee waiver. BPD said, you have to pay us $400,000 if you actually want these records. Under review, the cost actually went down to $160,000. That went up to the Court of Special Appeals. The Court of Special Appeals said, you do have to pay these fees. Or the BPD said, I'm sorry, the Court of Special Appeals said, BPD, you cannot make the public pay these fees because disclosure of your own records is in the public interest. They had looked to a prior case that had been ruled on in this past December against the Office of the State's Attorney of Baltimore City, where the Baltimore City State's Attorney had to disclose their misconduct records against the police department. And the Court of Special Appeals said unambiguously that misconduct records held by the State's Attorney's Office are in the public interest. They have to be disclosed for free. Even though we have this binding record, and some opinions that come out of the Court of Special Appeals are binding, some are not binding. By binding, I mean some apply to everybody, some don't only apply to the court or the parties in that case. That case was binding and applied across the state. Even though that case came out in December, police departments have been saying, well, that's just talking about state's attorneys. We're police departments. That doesn't apply to us. So we're arguing it's the same thing. We're talking about a law department or law enforcement officials and misconduct files. The police departments are like, we don't care. Take us to court. Drain your resources. So we had this other case. The Court of Special Appeals came out and said, no, these cases are the exact same. Your case means that you have to disclose these records for free as well. But they issued that case unpublished, which makes it non-binding, which means it's only applicable to the parties between the case. So that's our parties, which were Open Justice Baltimore, which is a community organization in Baltimore, which publishes misconduct records of Baltimore Police Department or officers. Check out bpdwatch.com to check out their work, and the Baltimore Police Department. And that's very common. Most cases in the Court of Special Appeals come out unpublished. We have requested to have that opinion published. They've responded to have it not published. And they also asked the court to reconsider their opinion. The court has recently asked us to respond to their motion to reconsider. So we're kind of in this holding pattern right now, waiting to see what the court's going to do. Are they going to publish it or not? Hopefully, we are hopeful that they will respond and publish the opinion. And at that point, all police departments across the state will now have this binding opinion saying police reports or files of police misconduct will have to be released at no cost. And we had requested a year's worth. So, a significant amount of police reports or police misconduct investigations will have to be released at no cost.
Okay, thanks for that. Delegate Gabriel Acevero, one of the co-authors of Anton's Law, has joined us. I don't know if he can unmute himself and join the conversation. We'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts about how the law is doing so far. I don't know how much you've heard of our conversation so far. I would say that we're giving a mixed and not too optimistic report at this point. Are you able to?
Thanks so much
good.
for thanks so much for having me. I just stepped off the floor there, so I
Yep.
won't be able to be on for too long. But I caught the tail end of Matt's comments. Didn't hear much before, but in terms of Anton's Law and its passage, is what we were pushing for. Senator Joe P. Carter and I, with the introduction of that bill, is that there was a lot of focus placed, and rightly so, on the repeal of the LEOBR, the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, and as important as its full repeal, was, LEOBR deals with everything after, whereas Anton's Law, particularly around transparency, deals with everything before, as it relates to an officer's misconduct record. Currently exists on a law enforcement officer's personnel record. And as we've seen in many instances, in police brutality cases, both here in Maryland and across the country, there's a pattern. There's a pattern in the sense that abusive officers, their records are only made public when we see, an incident, hit the news, or some video surfaced online, or something that not only really national attention as well. And at that point, we really hear a lot more about and the long list of misconduct complaints, those that have been sustained, unsustained. And so the goal of Anton's Law, which was in essence one of the often Dover, Delaware, with pretty abusive force reports and complaints that in essence only came to light when he, in essence, was let go from the Dover Police Department when a case indictments were dropped against him. Then, the public knew a little bit about his record and multiple use of force reports and complaints, and that shouldn't be, because part of understanding, the pattern abuse and really rooting out those abusive cohorts, that they are not just folks that are known, not just by the department, but also by the public. And so that can not only spur action, but it gives public greater awareness of the people who are necessarily patrolling those streets.
One of the issues that comes up time and time again are officers just like that officer who are allowed to move from department to department. Sometimes the police chief won't even get that personnel information, because it's been either negotiated through a contract or some other reason. Is there any effort in Maryland that would automatically make past records, including records of, charges that were dropped, available to the hiring officers or the hiring department? Is that, okay?
I think that
Yeah.
there's definitely been some discussion about it. I know there was discussion about it last session, and there's definitely interest, especially when discussing with some of the municipal mayors and elected officials. This is something that's come up in our discussions where they said this is something that they would like and would find useful to them, because it's harder to kind of let go an officer who might commit some of these abuses than it is to just never hire them to begin with, or afterwards it just, the damage has already been done. So a lot of them say that they would love to have this kind of information available to them so they can prevent those folks from even coming onto the force to begin with.
Right. Senator Carter has now joined us. Are you able to give your thoughts on where Anton's law stands? And I know you probably haven't heard our discussion, but I think you already know of our laments.
I do. First, let me apologize. We had to go right to the floor at this very
Nope.
time you started.
I know.
And there's background noise where I am, so I apologize about that because I'm in the back of the floor. So I'll just be a few minutes. I just wanted to join and say thank you for having this. I think it's important. I'm happy, actually, believe it or not. I know you've probably talked about the legislation. I'm actually happy that we have put the task force in place, because I think that good will come out of it. And, when I sponsored the bill this year that was supposed to be the fix, I wasn't altogether comfortable that it was the correct fix. I just knew that we needed to do something. So I put it in as a starting point, and I'm glad that it resulted in bringing all of the stakeholders together to be able to come up with the right solution. I don't think that the legislation that we passed for police accountability, the last year's Transparency and Accountability Act, I don't think that we need two components that we didn't get. We need Anton's law to work for the public disclosure of police disciplinary records, because police can't police themselves, and that's been proven time and time again. And then we need civilian oversight, which is what we're still working on. And then we have those two things. I think we'll see some real change.
On the civilian oversight, a lot of jurisdictions have been sort of barely getting started on setting up those panels. Is there anything that, is there a timetable that they absolutely have to meet?
They're supposed to.
Yeah,
they're supposed to be doing it by July 1.
Okay.
I know
Okay.
that they're going to need a lot of help, because a lot of them are going to be resistant, and a lot of them are going to be defiant, just like with Anton's law. Hold up, let me see if I can. I'm sorry, I'm not on the
That's
camera.
okay.
Hi.
Oh, great.
A lot of them are going to be resistant, just like with Anton's law. So I have a feeling that we're going to have to come back. And I look at what we passed as a starting point for that as well. Ultimately, we need civilian oversight bodies to have full authority to make decisions when it comes to police discipline. Again, the concept that the people work for the police. The police work for the people, and the people should be able to have oversight. For far too long, we've had a culture that says we don't have a right to determine the policing in our communities. And I think the only way to move forward properly is to change that. So I think that's important. It is not an anomaly. It's not common, but some other places have authentic civilian oversight bodies funded by the police department.
And what about the whole fee issue? Is there anything the General Assembly can do to help jurisdictions who say they want to comply, but that it's just been an overwhelming ask from the public, and they don't have the staff?
So I think hopefully the task force will work that out. But I think that in the hearing that we had, some solutions were proposed that are probably a starting point or maybe viable, which is the idea that what's digital should be easily attainable, easily able to be presented. And then maybe some of the other stuff that may be visual, the body camera footage and that stuff, that might be the second layer of it. Like someone could look at the digital information and determine whether or not they need to go further. I think that was a pretty plausible solution, I think, proposed by the Public Defender's Office.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was agreeing, and it's good to see Senator Carter on the panel. But I was just agreeing that the transparency piece is the big piece of it, right? We that's the first piece of it. Rather, we can't have accountability without transparency, and so we have to get that right. And prior to Anton's law being passed, what we were seeing was police departments, law enforcement agencies not necessarily complying with reporting standards or legislation that had been passed in the session prior around reporting use of force and other important information. And so we have to get the transparency piece right, but I will also add that there are a number of other pieces to police transparency and accountability that we really have to address. Senator Carter touched on, you know, the work that we need to do to touch upon Anton's law, but also around civilian review boards and having, you know, investigative, but also powers to be able to levy punishment. But I think there are some other things that we need to be looking at as well, such as ending qualified immunity in state court, something that Colorado, New Mexico, and a number of other states have done, and we need to do right here in Maryland. We also need to look at the issue of white nationalism in law enforcement. It's something that's very serious. There's an article that came out a couple of days ago about some officers in my own county, Park Police, and just some of the comments and exchanges in what was supposed to be private chats and what was shared. We have to address the issue of white nationalism in law enforcement that an unredacted FBI assessment shows is a serious problem. We also need to address the issue of no-knock warrants. We see more recently with the case of Amir Locke in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's something that we committed to last session, but we didn't follow through on, and we need to see that as well. And then, of course, ensuring prosecutorial accountability for the people who are charged with the responsibility of bringing law enforcement officers to account and ensuring that there's a separation there, and protecting minors during interrogations to ensure that, you know, police tactics aren't being used against minors who are susceptible to that. So there's a lot of work that we still need to do, but I think transparency is certainly the big piece of it, because without that, we can't really address some of the other issues surrounding police violence.
Yanet and Matt, do either now, while we have these two lawmakers on the call, do you have any specifics you want to suggest to them or questions you want to ask them?
I think they covered pretty much everything, and I would just echo just the importance of all the legislation that was mentioned that we still need to get through and need to come back and strengthen next year, especially around the civilian oversight piece. A lot of jurisdictions have not yet implemented the police accountability boards or haven't even begun to start implementing them. And there's been a lot of resistance and pushback to local organizers and coalitions and groups that have been advocating for recommendations to both strengthen these boards, but also make sure that there's some transparency on who is selected to be on these boards, and ensuring that they're actually going to be members that reflect the communities that have been impacted, and that they have all the resources that they need to actually adequately hold police accountable. And then we need to absolutely go back and strengthen some of the powers that these boards have as well, so they can actually be effective. And I think that's really critical and goes hand in hand with Anton's law and making sure that that also works. But that accountability measure is also really critical.
And one thing that I'd add, Miranda, this is Rebecca from MDDC. The overused exemptions are just out of hand. You know, everything can be an investigatory record. Everything is under a deliberative process, so it seems. And so I hear from journalists every day about the difficult ways to pull records out that should be available. So I think exemptions are another area we need to look at.
Matt, how about you?
It's also great to see Senator Carter and Delegate Acevero. I'm big fans, so thank you so much for everything you do. Big fan of Yanet as well. But yeah, as Senator Carter said, the police cannot police themselves. Like, we've seen this forever. So this is not just about the reason that Anton's law, came about, and the killing of Anton Black that could have been stopped is huge. But I think this goes deeper than being able to dig deep into one officer's record. I think it's important to be able to see the entirety of misconduct records for a police office. We've seen with the Steptoe report initially coming out, the Steptoe investigative team that just came out. I mean, they made very clear, looking at the past 20 years, that there had been corruption and violence that had been going on and just really kept in the shadows, and two blind eyes turned for 20 years, and BPD commanders and the Baltimore City Department of Law sitting ringside really let it go. So without real public access, that stuff is going to stay in the shadows. And the next gun trace task force is going to easily continue right now. We already see who those officers are on the street right now. We can name them. And nothing's being done because we can't get access to their files. I've been requesting single files as well, and we're already well past our 30-day date. And they say we don't have the personnel because they only put 2 to 3 people in their document compliance unit at a time when they've got over $500 million budget for the entire department. This is very intentional. Everything they do is very intentional. So I think it's not just about being able to go deep into one officer's file, but to be able to give access to the entire department to see where they're not going deep into their investigations are not going deep into anybody's files, because other departments have been looked at a little bit deeper. Like Chicago, I think, has made some headway, that the Invisible Institute's created something called the Citizens Police Data Project, where they've started to see escalation of violence in officers' careers and pull them off the street before they start pulling guns. They've started to see how units can start to be infectious in the way of corruption and see how departments operate. And departments are not doing these types of investigations inside, but once you get the corruption investigations as a whole to the public are going to do it. So I just think the mass data is really important to get outside the department.
Also, is there, there's always a tension between the local state's attorney and the police department. And we know that some of the departments have put out what they call their Brady lists, which interestingly enough is named after a Maryland case, Brady versus Maryland, a Supreme Court case. But there's also, I'm just wondering if there's any way to take some of this outside of the purview of the local state's attorney, because, to some degree, those relationships are a walking conflict of interest. Is there anything that can be done there? Should the attorney general, who generally doesn't have criminal prosecutorial sway, is there anything that ought to happen there as far as dealing with officers who have poor records? Question really is for anybody who might want to tackle it.
I think we'd want that in the hands of the community. I think there's still going to be a conflict of interest, even if it's the attorney general or some other, agent of the state, but we do trust the community members. And so, we're not just talking about these just incidents that result in killings, but there's a number of incidents that lead up to before it gets that serious. And I think the Steptoe report also highlights that a lot of these officers got away with smaller crimes before they conducted some of these more serious offenses. And because they could get away with those previous offenses, it didn't prevent them or make them shy away from trying to commit some of these more serious crimes. And we know that the likelihood of, just like with crime in the community, same thing with police officers, it's a likelihood of getting caught and held accountable that deters people from actually committing those crimes, not the actual punishment. And so I think with the incident or report that Delegate Acevero mentioned with that Montgomery County police officer, those are incidences and experiences that a lot of Black and brown officers experience. And a lot of them are in favor and support of that oversight and transparency because they know what's going on inside, and they're retaliated against when trying to speak up about it. And I don't think they would, I think they'd have more trust in the community than they would, and again, an agent of the state. And so I think that's really critical. And then also when we talk about, I think it's a public safety issue as well. I think a lot of reason why police aren't successful in solving some of these more quote unquote violent crimes is because they don't have that participation from the community, and they can't have that participation because they don't have that relationship and trust with the community. And so until we fix the accountability and we fix the transparency, that's going to continue to be an issue, and that translates into how successful if at all they're going to be in actually solving some of these and identifying these violent drivers of crime in our communities.
We've got, Miranda, did you see
Yep.
some of the questions that are coming
I
in?
do.
Okay.
And actually one of the questions relates to the issue of the Brady list, which is the officers that a DA, a state's attorney, doesn't want to call because they have credibility problems. And the question is, what steps would need to be taken to put the Brady list in the hands of each community that's affected? Is there anything that could be done legislatively to do that?
It should be, there is case law on that now that it should be disclosed.
But you have to ask for it, right? It's not proactively disclosed. Yeah. Well, and you know, about a year ago, actually, I was asking the state's attorney in Prince George's for the Brady list. And this is before it actually sort of became in vogue to do in Maryland. And she claimed that she was being told that she couldn't release it, which I found baffling because in many states these lists are released. But you do have, at this point in Maryland, you have to ask for it. You can't, it's not out there exactly, as I understand it.
But there is also still, you know, a fight going on to what constitutes an investigatory file and getting how they investigate police to ensure, you know, what their investigations of police are being disclosed to see that they're holding police to the same standards we are, because I do think they are police. You know, the criminal justice system puts them in a position where they have to cooperate with police. So as soon as they are now holding police accountable, they can't do their job. Police are their enforcement arm. So for them to now have to operate against police, the system's kind of against itself.
There's another question, and I don't know if Senator Carter or Delegate Acevero would be interested in tackling this one, but this person points out that there is an annual report about complaints filed about attorneys who are not behaving correctly in Maryland. What about having essentially a statewide database for law enforcement officers? Is that something that could, you know, you could go online and look at the complaints?
That issue was debated last year and it was proposed. I think Senator Charles Sidnor actually had a bill that would have done that. For some reason, it was rejected because at the end of the day, the actual legislation that passed was above all of our pay grade. There was a higher up decision that made about what's going to get through and what's not. But that brings me to the point I wanted to make a little before, which is that when Delegate Acevero was speaking about the various legislation that we still need to pass, and there's quite a long list, I'm concerned that there is legislative fatigue and that the legislature feels very comfortable that we did major legislation last year and they're going to be hesitant to come back and revisit it. Proof in the pudding, I had some what I would call cleanup bills or like extensions of what we talked about last year, and they haven't moved in committees this year. So no interest. So finally, I think that what Yanet said is critically important, that all members of the public, all members of the media need to keep the dialogue open, that police accountability is a public safety matter. Because the reason we're not able to pass anything this year, I'm trying to move out of the other noise, but it's hard, sorry. The reason that we can't pass anything this year is because the narrative is this is an election year and we have to deal with public safety, as if fixing police isn't public safety. So that's a real problem with this legislative body. It's been like this for a long time. You tackle an issue and then you don't want to do anything else on it for a long time until some other tragedy happens.
Delegate Acevero, it looks like you wanted to say something as well. Yeah. Okay. 1 second.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. I think I was listening to the bill there, but I forgot what the question was. Can someone repeat that? Remember?
Yeah, the question was really well, Senator Carter says there's legislative fatigue, actually, and so
Yes,
needed
yes,
down
that's
payment,
right. That's
but
right.
much remains to be done, and how to go about that. And could we have a statewide
Yeah.
database of officers?
Yeah. Well, two things. One is that I'll just echo Senator Carter's comments that I think you all, obviously, the journalists, the folks who sort of shed light where, light isn't placed, and light is the greatest transparency, right? But we're going to be counting on those very same journalists that not only cover criminal justice, but particularly public safety to ensure that we're continuing to push for the kind of transparency and accountability legislation that advocates, but also impacted communities have been pushing for some time. Senator Carter mentioned the legislative fatigue, and she's absolutely right in that, because when we've always addressed police accountability, it's usually in response to police killing or police brutality case. And instead, what we would like to see is more proactive legislating, where we know there are some things that we should be working on. How do we get those passed so that we're providing that kind of a trust and that kind of accountability that communities expect? Some of the bills that I just mentioned, in part, my frustration and why I submitted them as floor amendments last year is because these were some of the concerns that I was bringing up in the House Work Group on Police Accountability in Maryland, because I believe that if we're really addressing the issue of police accountability, we have to be honest about white nationalism in law enforcement. We have to be honest about ending qualified immunity. We have to be honest about ending no-knock warrants and prosecutorial accountability. Now, in terms of the Brady list and putting that out, I think we do need to see that. We need to see more lists, and the public should know about individuals who are not just unreliable, but officers who have a tendency to lie. Because again, all of this provides a preponderance of evidence, if you will, for us to be taking a closer look at these very same problematic officers, because if they're lying, particularly about incidences, then there may be some other incidences of misconduct elsewhere that should be investigated and that prosecutors should be keeping an eye on. I'll also add really quickly, and I'll wrap it up here, is that states attorneys play a role. States attorneys and the attorney general play a role in police accountability, but we do not hold them accountable enough. And these are folks that we elect. According to Mapping Police Violence, 97% of police brutality cases, prosecutors decline to bring charges. Only 1% result in a conviction. And that speaks to not just really what I think is an incestuous relationship between prosecutors and police associations and groups, but it also speaks to shining some more light on what kind of a contributions is given, who is taking what kind of a contributions from what groups, and how that correlates with just a lack of prosecutions. But I do think we need to see more transparency in that area.
I just want to mention also that Sean Mussenden, I don't know if he's on the call, but he's a professor at the University of Maryland Journalism School, and they are working to compile a statewide database so that, and I'll put his contact in the chat, but if any of you have reports of misconduct that you have already obtained, he's trying to put it all together into one database. It's not an official state database, and it will obviously have gaps in it, but it's certainly a starting point. So that's something else to think about. I wonder, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just on what Senator Carter said, there is a lot of fatigue in getting folks to talk about Anton's Law again this year, but the bill that she brought adding some sanctions for police departments not complying was absolutely huge and extremely important, because police departments do not care about going to court and being taken to court. And she put forth a bill that would actually make it somewhat fearful to be taken to court for just blatantly disregarding the bill. So I can't stress how commendable we think that was and important that is to us. And also the Brady list, we are pushing that so hard. We got a billboard, downtown to call for the Brady list to be pushed out, because that's not just about knowing in the community and pushing folks out, but that's like direct freedom today, because folks are being held pre-trial on arrests of dirty officers And the state's attorney doesn't let us know who those officers are until right before trial because they're still pushing plea deals. So if the community and the public knows those names at arrest, at a bail hearing, we can push that those officers are not going to get a conviction, and we can get those names out. We can get people back their freedom because these arrests are no good. And there's so many. There's so many applications to justice from just getting to know those names. So
If I
the
could
more conversation we can have around that, I think it would be absolutely enormous.
I completely echo everything Matt just said, and I just wanted to also state that while there might be fatigue in the legislator, there isn't fatigue in the community, and the communities and organizations that we've been organizing with are still very much ensuring the adequate implementation of these laws and further strengthening police accountability in their communities for the reasons that Matt stated. They're not only resulting in the taking of lives in the streets, but also in the courts as well. And every single one of them deserve adequate justice, and something that we're committed to making sure we see through.
Thanks. Anybody else want to have any concluding remarks, or if there's one last burning question out there, put it in the chat right away. Delegate Acevero, any more from you, or Matt, or Rebecca, or Yanet? Thank you all very much for an enlightening discussion. Maybe we'll move the ball forward a little bit with this, who knows? Rebecca, do you want to say anything in conclusion?
Nothing terribly profound, except thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate you all with candid commentary about what's going on here. I'm going to give the last word to Delegate Acevero and let you all know that the recording of this will be up on our website shortly. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to just say thank you so much to all of the organizers of this virtual panel. Just really important conversation about Anton's law, about transparency, how we strengthen transparency so that you all can do your jobs and you're not hindered, but also communities have the transparency which they've been demanding, and also the accountability that they deserve. So appreciate that. Please continue to cover this. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done around police transparency and accountability, as was mentioned by Senator Carter, and we're going to be continuing to push for that. So appreciate it, and really good to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. I know it's a challenge on a day like this, so we appreciate it. I think that's pretty much it. Thanks to the audience and your good questions, and Matt, Yanet, Senator Carter, Delegate Acevero, and Rebecca, of course, for getting us all together here. So I think we're probably done, but let's see if there are any last questions here. So guess not. Anyway, thanks very much to everybody, and I hope we can keep this conversation going.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.